For the last handful of years, I would sit down at my workstation in the morning, whether it's at the office, mostly at home, and I would feel all this resistance in my body. Like there was something in my being that was already saying no before the day even started. I know a lot of you resonate with that feeling. You know, that feeling of misalignment, being burnt out, not caring. And feeling those feelings, that inner battle, I would just sit down and do it anyway. Like many of you probably do as well. Recently, in my performance evaluation, me and my boss sat down, and she was talking about how my work was good, solid, but she was hoping for another gear out of me. And I was like, another gear? I'm barely holding on here. You know, like, little do you know, I'm barely functioning. Like, I mean, I'm doing the job, but forgetting about another gear. I never considered myself a career executive assistant. My allegiance, my passion, my life focus was more on this developmental agenda that I had with myself. And so my boss looked at me and said, you know, maybe now's the time then. You know, because I talked about still feeling burnt out. And we have been exploring this conversation since my sabbatical last summer. And she mentioned that if I thought that this was something to take seriously, that she was in a position to help me with a severance package. And so this was the first time it became real for me. My boss had opened the door, and the question became, was I going to walk through? And so for a couple of weeks, I considered this one of the biggest decisions of my life in the last decade. And I decided to walk through that door into the great unknown. Not to be cheesy about it, but that's what it feels like. So in 15 days, 2 weeks' time, I'm gonna be leaving my job of 12 years. And honestly, it's pretty terrifying. I'm making the decision. I felt this huge wave of relief, knowing that that inner battle was gonna go away and that I wouldn't have to deal with that anymore. I felt free and excited about figuring out what's next, having the space, the opportunity to build a new life, change things up. But I also felt fear, a lot of fear. You know, in a way you feel like you're jumping into this existential void. And your brain starts to create all these stories. So what the fear really amounts to, for me, is what I like to call the drift. And, you know, I just knowing myself, I like to go to bed late, I like to sleep late. I could easily get into these YouTube spirals, you know, one more podcast, one more video, or even like another book. And the alluring thing about that is that it feels educational, like you're being productive, like you're learning stuff. But at the end of the day, it's just what Julian himself, the transformational coach, he calls it being a knowledge collector. And it's not only that, it's, you know, my life feels thinner than I'd care to admit. And, you know, I realized that my job provided a certain kind of structure. And I used to have my church and my Muay Thai gym that I used to go to, and were, you know, important parts of community for me. And I haven't been to either in quite a long time. And, you know, right now I'm trying to be budget conscious, so that kind of weighs in to it. And I'm going to rethink that. I'm going to be looking for my way to get back to doing that, because those were important forms of community for me. And community is important. And I realized that, like, my account's only going to be going down, like, in one direction. And so I'm just being very conscious of that, maybe too conscious of it, but I could always be a little bit more disciplined right now and then kind of loosen up as time goes by. But here's what nobody tells you about that: the fear. It doesn't go away. It just kind of changes shape, and it just kind of like settles into the background, you know, almost like this background companion that you have to learn to live with. And some days it's greater in intensity and the world feels heavier. And then some days it's not as heavy and you're more excited and looking forward and optimistic. And, you know, I think it's not about trying to do away with the fear. It's more about trying to make friends with everything that's there and just let it be and act anyway. You know, so I don't want you to think that this is some sort of chaotic decision. It is very much a structured bet on myself that I have this severance that I'm very lucky to have, because I realize that there's a lot of people out there that don't have that option. And for that reason, they stay stuck in their job. And if I was to be perfectly honest with you, I would probably still stay in my job, despite feeling misaligned and my heart being over it. If I didn't have that funded runway to figure out what's next, I think I would have stayed. And I'm not proud of that, but I just want to be honest with you. And I know that a lot of people are struggling with that as well, wanting to leave but not knowing how to financially make it feasible. And that sucks. You know, that's like when you watch videos about people talking about this modern 9-to-5 slave system. I think that's what they mean, you know. You become trapped by the high cost of living paycheck to paycheck, and you become trapped by your life in a way. You know, a lot of people got childcare and they have people that depend on them, and you can't just like up and quit without like a way to make that financially feasible. So I'm feeling very lucky. So despite the fear of drifting and squandering it, I know that I need to get beyond that, because I know that I don't want to go back to 9 to 5. And even though I had a flexible, comfortable job, I realized that, you know, life is going to include a lot of suffering and hard work, just naturally. And I would rather suffer and work hard building my own thing rather than building someone else's dream that I don't really internally feel invested in. And that led to the sense of performing and misalignment and lack of energy, because there was no sort of like internal resonance, you know? And so I want to take this time to build new skills around what does resonate. Things like storytelling and video editing and personal brand building. So that's what I'm going to do. Even as daunting as that seems right now. Just sort of having faith that it's going to lead me in the direction where I want to go. So I don't know where this leads, where this all leads, but I know where I was and what I was doing wasn't working anymore, and that's all that I had to go on. And, maybe that's enough. So, a few weeks ago, I was reading The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which is a short book by Tolstoy. You could leisurely read it over the weekend, or even a day if you really want to. But it really cuts to the bone. And it tells a story about Ivan Ilyich, who's this middle-aged lawyer who has this comfortable, respectable life, and he has a certain amount of status, and he's got a good family, and he comes down with this terminal illness. And so the book recounts him like teetering between life and death, and he realizes that on his deathbed that he had lived his whole life wrong, and he had been in this delusion about everything that he was chasing were the wrong things, like your ladder being up against the wrong wall for your whole life. And it reminded me of Plato's cave. If you know that allegory, there's people who live inside the cave, and they live in this world where they think that is their whole reality. But it's not until one person gets out of the cave and he sees this larger world around him, and he sees the sunlight, and he realizes that all along they've been living in this delusion. And it made me think of like this resistance, this misalignment, and this performance that I felt I was embodying in my role. And it made me realize that I have a lot in common with Ivan. We're all Ivan in a way, where we realize that there are this like inauthentic aspects of our life, or we're performing a life, or we're not showing up for the life that is our deeper truth. And one thing that Dr. James Hollis talks about in his book is how we all have this appointment with our soul. And it's in the second half of life where it becomes way more imperative that you show up for this appointment with your soul. You start tuning inward more. You start asking yourself the hard questions, like I am right now. I just turned 40, and I'm starting to ask myself, like, am I in the right job? Do I want to continue living in the city? And I started asking yourself about the relationships in your life, how you want the next half of your life to go, and what you want that to look like. Do I feel authentically embodied in my life? And if it's no, then it becomes really important to figure this out. It reminds me of what Robert Greene, the author, said about how the real tragedy of life isn't death, but it's the drift that I talked about earlier. Never really showing up for your life, squandering it. And that's something that really scares the shit out of me. And this is why I was happy to be reading James Hollis's books, who recommended The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and then I read that. And it all happened at the time that I was deciding whether I was going to leave. And it's funny how these things find you at the times that you need them. So yeah, I realized that a lot of people may be in the same situation where they're feeling burnt out or have a hard time summoning the energy to do their jobs anymore. Like, my position wasn't necessarily a bad job or anything. Like, people were great. The organization was really a great organization. Treated their employees really wonderfully. But there was just a sense like I don't fit here anymore. I just want you to know I see you. I see you struggling. Feeling like your life feels good on paper, but underneath it all, you don't feel fulfilled, you don't feel happy, you don't feel like you're in the right place. And that's not an easy place to be in. Realize that it is costing you something to stay. And it's not going to get any better. You know, your heart has made the decision a long time ago. When feelings of being burnt out, you know, I learned that they don't go away. Because they're signals, and they're signaling that you're not in alignment anymore. And so the real question becomes not whether you could afford to leave, but it's whether you could afford to stay.